And as I've been thinking about what we call the liturgical calendar, I've been thinking a lot about patterns. You see, our liturgical calendar is just a pattern that moves us through the year. And it got me thinking about one of the very first patterns that I ever learned. It was in preschool. Do you all remember back to when your teachers taught you the pattern red, blue, red, blue? Circle, square, triangle. Circle, square, triangle. Maybe some of us need to go back to preschool and work on these patterns again. But patterns back then seemed pretty simple. It was a game of recognizing order in what otherwise might seem or feel chaotic. And that lesson, decades later, has prepared us to navigate the world that we have inherited from our parents and our grandparents, because patterns are everywhere. Now, these patterns are larger and more complex than a few shapes and a couple of colors on a worksheet in preschool. But patterns have been woven into the very fabric of creation itself. We have the rising and the setting of the sun, the ebb and flow of the tides, and the movements of our seasons, sometimes within the same week, are all patterns. Patterns help us understand how we are connected to the world and how we are connected to other people. And if we learn to recognize God's patterns at work in our lives, then we can see that there are times when the patterns we create or the patterns that we expect may be a little different from what God had in store for us. You see, for better or worse, we are shaped by our patterns. Patterns are how we approach our days, they're how we approach our relationships, and they're how we approach our faith. And some patterns, like the ones that we learned in preschool, are simple and good, but there are other patterns. Patterns of fear, selfishness, exclusion, patterns of bitterness. Those can distort us. And we find ourselves this morning, as Michelle read for us, this is a charged moment between Pontius Pilate, the governor of Jerusalem, and Jesus. I want you to picture this for a moment. You have Pilate seated in a place of power. He's surrounded by symbols of empire, authority, might, and ultimate control. And then we have Jesus, a traveling rabbi who hails from downtown Nazareth. Nazareth really isn't known for exporting anything. You'll remember from your childhood Sunday school classes a guy named Nathaniel sarcastically asking, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Jesus of Nazareth stands before Pilate, and he has no army and no throne. And Pilate begins his questioning, and you can hear the sarcasm in Pilate's voice. "Are you the king of the Jews?" It's not really a question. It's more of a challenge. You see, if Pilate can get Jesus to say yes, then Jesus can be dismissed as a seditious traitor and killed. If Jesus says no, then the religious leaders lose their claim against Jesus, and Jesus is back to being their problem. And in his line of questioning, Pilate thinks that he is in control. Pilate believes that one of two patterns will emerge from his line of questioning, but per usual, Jesus surprises us all by flipping the script on those of us who think that we're in control. Jesus asks Pilate, "Are those your ideas? Or did others talk to you about me?" While Pilate thinks he's interrogating Jesus, Jesus is now the one asking the questions. And Jesus is not interested in the pattern that Pilate's after. No, Jesus is after a new pattern for how a leader, for how a king leads. A pattern that originates from a softened and transformed heart. A pattern that has humility, service for others, and love at the heart, and not dominance or control or retribution. When Pilate protests, "Am I a Jew? Your own people handed you over to me. What is it you've done?" Jesus' response cuts through all of the noise, saying, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate doesn't know what to do with Jesus. Pilate is accustomed to kingdoms built on the pattern of soldiers, swords, and taxes. But Jesus is talking about a new pattern, a different pattern for how a king should behave, a different pattern for how a kingdom is formed, a kingdom not built on power but on truth, a kingdom not sustained by fear but by love, a kingdom not ruled through coercion but by mercy and grace. And Pilate, he's still grasping. "You're a king then," he says. And Jesus, with that claim of authority, unnerves us when he says, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to truth. And everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Truth. The truth of God is what Jesus is pointing to. Pilate sees kingdoms in terms of control and conquest, while Jesus reveals a kingdom shaped by the truth of God. And if we're honest with ourselves, we find ourselves in the moment like Pilate. We're uneasy with Jesus' words here because truth, real God-honest truth, does not bow to the expectations of the world. Does not bow to our expectations. It doesn't fit neatly into the patterns of the world that we are accustomed to. Because when we think about leaders, when we think about the kings of this world and the empires, we carry certain expectations. Whether we realize it or not, there is a pattern for how we expect them to behave. There's a pattern we expect them to follow. Since ancient Rome and even earlier, leadership has meant dominance. It means occupying armies. It means retribution. It means lavish displays of wealth. It means quid pro quo, and it means status of honor. A leader's worth was measured by the land they controlled, the armies they defeated, the opponents they unmercifully knocked down, and the people who trembled at their commands. This pattern is not confined to ancient empires. We gravitate towards, and some even admire, leaders who exude power and control and dominance. We expect our leaders to be strong and decisive and always a step ahead. They had better defend our interests, fix our problems, and keep everything in order, and keep those people in order, or we will find someone else who will. In Rome, Caesar was the ultimate symbol of that kind of power. Caesar embodied the pattern of worldly power. Victory through force, glory and wealth, and security through fear. The Romans had a saying for this pattern: Pax Roma, the peace of Rome. But everyone knew that peace came at a cost. It was the kind of peace that you could only maintain with legions of soldiers in the shadow of a sword. And so along comes Jesus. And instead of following the pattern of Pax Roma, he offered something entirely different. You'll remember a few days prior to this scene in John 18 that Jesus did not enter Jerusalem on the back of a warhorse. No, he enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on the back of a borrowed burro, a donkey. He doesn't wield a sword, but instead he kneels and he washes his disciples' feet. He doesn't command a legion of armies, but instead he called a group of fishermen and tax collectors to come and follow him. Jesus' pattern of kingship did not compute for Pilate, and it only sometimes makes sense to us. Jesus has never acted and has never looked like the king that we expect. He does not promise power and prestige to the church. He doesn't fight fire with fire. Instead, Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, and the first shall be last." We're so familiar with these patterns of empire that it can be difficult for us to embrace the pattern of Christ. And still, even if we can't recognize the pattern, even if that pattern offends us at times, and even if that pattern butts heads with our expectations, Jesus still invites us into this pattern and into a life of grace. A life that enables us to challenge assumptions of power, enables us to stand up to power when it tries to exploit, to harm, and to beat down. And if we pay attention, Jesus invites us to break free from the world's patterns and step into his saving grace. Amen.